Hey guys, welcome back to my channel and welcome back to my home. Today I'm going to show you how I made this quilted pattern cutting board. I was trying to think of something different that I could do in the shop. The inspiration for this board actually came from quilting. Now, I don't think there's probably a lot of woodworkers who are also quilters, but I enjoy both hobbies. I started sewing a long time ago, but it wasn't until I moved away to college and my grandmother bought me my first sewing machine that I actually started quilting. And the more I thought about how I make cutting boards, I kept thinking about how I make quilts. Geometric shapes pieced together, cut up, and pieced together again. And the end result is something beautiful and functional. And so that's the inspiration for this board. I'm going to call it the Irene, after my grandmother. Now, in quilters' term, this is actually called the Churn dash, if you're looking at quilting patterns for your own inspiration. Now, this board is a little more complicated than the boards that I've previously done. Initially, I thought I'd make this a lot like a quilt, where every square is a different color while you maintain the pattern. In woodworking, that's a little bit harder to do. So while I started out the project that way, I changed my mind about halfway through. So while you're watching, I'm going to put an indicator in the corner to tell you where we're at in the project, so I don't lose you. So if you're ready, let's go to the shop and we'll make the Irene.
I started this project at the miter saw, milling up lumber. I had 8/4 Padauk, 4/4 walnut, and 8/4 maple. These boards were all too large for my jointer. I started by just jointing one edge, and then I headed to the table saw and cut them down into more manageable pieces. After that, it was back to the jointer to flatten one face and square up one edge. And then I ended the milling journey at the thickness planer. The first group of boards that's going through the planer will be used for the 45-degree cuts. I milled these boards down to 1 inch. I set my miter saw bevel to 45 degrees to make the first squares. I've never used any angles on a cutting board. I was nervous about gluing them up. I was also nervous at the table saw about cutting the boards after the angle was made. So instead, I cut the angles on one edge and then kept the boards long for the glue up. This actually made my first glue up really easy. I had a nice long surface to keep it flat. And here's that first glue up. For my glue ups I use Titebond 3. Once the glue is applied, I'll tighten up the clamps and add some cauls. I'll leave the clamps on overnight and take them off after 24 hours. Then it's back to the table saw. I cut off the excess board, trying to be very careful of that 45-degree bevel. And then I used a piece that I had already made at 1 inch by 1 inch in order to act as a spacer to keep my cuts consistent. And then I made the center square, which is just a piece of maple 1 inch by 1 inch. And now back to the planer, and I'll make up the second squares. These smaller rectangles had to be milled so that they would line up perfectly with that 1 inch by 1 inch square. And then it's on to the glue up. Again, I use Titebond 3 and plenty of it. Since this isn't a panel, I'm doing this glue up a little differently. I'll glue one of the pieces of walnut to one of the pieces of Padauk. And if you'll notice, I'm leaving one of the edges without glue. I'll make sure that there's no glue between the sections. This allows me to take it apart. I can do these smaller pieces as one group, rather than having to do them individually and wait for the glue to dry. This just makes the entire glue up faster. I'll tighten up the clamps and apply the cauls. I'll leave the clamps on for 24 hours and take them off in the morning. This is the point where I decided that I really loved the look of the Padauk, maple, and walnut together, and I decided not to mix the colors from the two boards that I was making. And now it's on to the first row. So this row is made up of the smaller rectangles, the inner square, and another set of the smaller rectangles turned on end, creating a striped pattern. I'll apply plenty of glue between the sections, apply the clamps, and leave it in the glue up for 24 hours. A lot of times when I'm doing a glue up, I'll have help in the shop. And now for the second row. This row is made up of the 45-degree cuts, the stacked rectangles, and another 45-degree cut. I tried to make this more like a panel since I knew that the pattern would be repeating. I apply glue between the sections, tighten up the clamps, and remove the clamps in the morning. Everybody look busy. My supervisor's here. And it's back to the planer to remove the glue. Here it's easier to see the rows. I put the two panels in together to keep that 1-inch consistency. And now for my favorite part. I'm headed to the miter saw and I get to use my crosscut sled. I'll clean up one edge of the board and then I'll use a stop block set to 1 5/8 inch to make consistent cuts. 1 5/8 inch leaves a little bit of extra material so that when I go to plane this later, the finished product will be 1.5 inches. And now you can really see the pattern. This is another point where you can tell that I had a different plan originally. If I had to do it over again, I would make wider panels. Because I had these shorter panels, I decided to glue them up separately. So I glued each shorter section, flipping onto the end grain, and then glued the two sections together. Sometimes our helpers in the shop can kind of get in the way. It's really important to line up this pattern carefully as you do the glue up. Once I was satisfied with what I considered near perfection, I tightened up the clamps and left this panel overnight and then removed the clamps in the morning. And then I headed to the miter saw to clean up the edges.
borders. So I decided to add a border to the board.
Because I hadn't dyed my entire shop red already, I used the 8/4 Padauk to make the border. I followed the typical milling procedure for this board. First at the miter saw, then the jointer, then the table saw, then onto the planer. Because this is an end grain board, I wanted the border to also be made up of end grain, and I wanted to maintain the look of a cutting board with smaller sections. So after I milled this board up, I cut it into sections and then glued it into a panel. Clean up one edge, and then using the same stop block, I cut the boards to 1 5/8 inch. And then I had to glue each of the borders together. I kept the clamps on for 24 hours and removed them in the morning. And now it's time for the first border. When adding a border to a cutting board, it's actually easier to do one edge and then the other. So I applied glue to one set of borders, clamped it up, and left it in the clamps overnight. In the morning, I had a surprise inspection from my supervisor. He appeared to be satisfied with my work, so I removed the board from the clamps, took it over to the table saw, and removed the excess edge. And now it's time for that second border. Again, using plenty of glue, I applied the clamps for 24 hours and removed them in the morning. To flatten the surface of this end grain board, I used my router and a flathead bit and a router sled that I made. This is safer than using a planer. If you use a planer to flatten an end grain board, you run the risk of damaging both the board and your equipment. I watched a CNC machine flatten a board, and I picked up some tips. I noticed that the machine cleaned up all the edges first and then flattened the entire surface. I tried this method out and found that I had a lot less tear out. I mean, if it's good enough for a CNC machine, it's probably good enough for me. Once the entire surface was planed, I sanded the board with 40 grit paper until smooth. I like to mark the board up with pencil before I sand with my random orbital sander, just to keep track of where I've been. Once the entire surface has been sanded, I'll flip the board over and do the other face. And then back to the table saw to remove the excess border. And now time for more sanding. I'll sand the board with 80 grit, 120, 180, 220, and 320 grit until smooth to the touch. This lets the board shine like glass. I'll do both faces and then the edges. Now on to those little extras. I'll use this 1/8 round over bit to create a nice profile on the ends and face of the board. I just love how this looks. Then I'll add a handle using this jig I made for my router and a round nose bit. And finally, a last bit of sanding of the edges and the handles. I'll soak the board in food-grade mineral oil for 5 minutes and then allow it to dry overnight before I apply a generous helping of walrus oil wood wax for cutting boards. I'll leave the wood wax on for at least 3 hours and then buff it out. Well, despite all the ups and downs and changing my mind, I love the way this board turned out. I hope you'll join me as I add to the Quilted Cutting Board series. Until next time, I'll see you in the shop.